Imagine being just a teenager, cast out by the ones you trusted most, left to face the world alone with nothing but your will to survive. This is Zena's story, a tale of heartbreak, resilience, and the unyielding fight for dignity. Forced to leave her home after an unplanned pregnancy, Zena embarks on a journey through rejection, betrayal, and unexpected kindness. But when her path leads her to confront her past, a powerful revelation changes everything. The narrow alley between the rows of houses in Harmony Estate was usually quiet after sundown, except for the occasional bark of stray dogs or the distant hum of a passing car. Tonight, however, the sound of hushed voices and stifled laughter came from a shadowed corner near a broken streetlight. Zena, barely 15 years old, sat cross-legged on a low stone wall, her face illuminated by the faint glow of her phone as she scrolled through songs, her heart racing with anticipation. "Zena!" a deep voice whispered from the other side of the wall. Startled, she looked up to see Ethan climbing over with the ease of someone who had done it countless times before. He was 18, tall and lanky, his hands roughened by the grease of his apprenticeship as a mechanic. Despite his worn-out jeans and oil-stained shirt, Ethan always managed to carry himself with an air of confidence that Zena found irresistible. "You're late," she teased, a mischievous smile tugging at her lips. "Sorry, babe," Ethan replied, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Uncle Harold kept me at the workshop longer than usual." Zena giggled, leaning into his touch. They had been sneaking around for months now, defying the warnings of her parents. Ethan was her escape, a breath of fresh air in her stiflingly strict household. But tonight was different. Marcus, Zena's father, had begun to suspect something was amiss. Earlier that evening, he had seen the glint of a flashlight outside Zena's bedroom window. Suspicion turned to fury when he overheard her whispering through the slats of her window. "You'll ruin yourself with this nonsense," Marcus had bellowed, his voice echoing through the house. "That boy has nothing to offer you but trouble." Despite her mother Amara's pleas to end the relationship, Zena was undeterred. "You don't understand," she had yelled back, slamming the door to her room. The next day, Marcus took drastic action. As Zena sat at the kitchen table, dreading the confrontation to come, Marcus entered the room with a firm expression. "You won't be going back to school," he announced, his voice as cold as steel, "until you learn to respect this family and stay away from that boy." Zena's heart dropped. School was her safe haven, the only place where she felt free to dream of a life beyond Harmony Estate. But her father's decision was final. The days that followed were agonizing. She watched her friends walk past her house every morning, laughing and chatting on their way to class while she was stuck inside, her father's unspoken anger hanging over the house like a storm cloud. Despite her father's attempts to isolate her, Zena found ways to see Ethan. She timed her visits for moments when her family was out or asleep. They met in secret, at the park, behind the mechanic shop, or in the quiet corners of the estate. Each stolen moment felt like an act of rebellion, a defiance against a world that sought to keep them apart. One evening, their secret unraveled. Marcus, accompanied by Zena's two older brothers, Daniel and Joseph, marched to Ethan's uncle's house. With them were two police officers, their uniforms stark against the twilight. "Ethan!" Marcus's voice thundered through the neighborhood as he pounded on the door. The door creaked open, revealing Uncle Harold, who looked both confused and wary. "What is this about?" Harold asked, his eyes narrowing as he stepped onto the porch. "This boy has been sneaking around with my daughter," Marcus spat, his anger barely contained. "I warned him, but he didn't listen. I won't have him ruin her life." Before Ethan could protest, the officers stepped forward, cuffing his hands behind his back. Zena, who had been watching from the corner of the street, ran toward the scene, her heart pounding. "Dad, stop!" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "He didn't do anything wrong!" Marcus turned to her, his face dark with rage. "You'll thank me one day for this," he growled before dragging her back toward their house. Ethan was released on bail the next day, but his uncle's disappointment was evident. "You've brought shame to this family," Harold said, shaking his head. "I won't let you stay here anymore. Pack your things and go back to your parents' house." Ethan left Harmony Estate that evening, his belongings stuffed into a duffel bag. Zena stood at her window, watching his silhouette fade into the distance. Her chest ached with the weight of loss, but she refused to cry. In her heart, She believed this was not the end of their story. Unbeknownst to Zena, the road ahead would be more difficult than she could ever imagine. The days passed slowly after Ethan's departure, each one blending into the next. The once vibrant Zena became a shadow of herself, staring out the window for hours, hoping for a sign of him. Life in her father's house felt like a prison. Marcus's rules were unyielding, and Amara's silent compliance only deepened Zena's loneliness. One chilly morning, as the first hints of harmattan painted the skies in muted grays, Zena began to feel unwell. At first, she dismissed it as exhaustion from sleepless nights, but the symptoms persisted: nausea in the mornings, dizziness, and an aversion to food. Alarmed, she confided in a neighbor, Aunt Grace, who listened intently before gently placing a hand on Zena's trembling shoulder. "Child," Aunt Grace said softly, her expression grave. "When was your last cycle?" Zena's heart sank. She hadn't kept track, but her mind raced back to the night she and Ethan had shared their deepest intimacy, promising to stand by each other no matter what. The truth was undeniable, yet she clung to a sliver of doubt, unwilling to face the reality. Later that week, Aunt Grace handed Zena a small packet and whispered instructions in her ear. Zena waited until the house was quiet before locking herself in the bathroom. The minutes stretched into eternity as she stared at the test strip. 2 faint lines appeared, confirming her worst fear. Pregnant. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the sink, tears streaming down her face. How would she tell her parents? Would Ethan even know? Fear and uncertainty consumed her. But secrets have a way of unraveling. It was Marcus who found out first. Amara had noticed Zena's pale complexion and unusual appetite and mentioned it to him in passing. Without a word, Marcus stormed into Zena's room that evening, his face a mask of fury. "Is it true?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp as a blade. Zena froze, her back pressed against the wall. "What do you mean?" she whispered, though she knew exactly what he meant. "Don't play dumb with me, girl!" Marcus roared, his voice echoing through the house. "Are you pregnant?" The truth hung heavy in the air, suffocating her. Zena nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. "You disgrace this family!" Marcus bellowed. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" Amara appeared at the door, her hands trembling as she tried to calm her husband. "Marcus, please," she begged. "Let's talk about this." "There is nothing to talk about," Marcus spat. "This girl has brought shame upon us. She's no longer welcome here." Zena fell to her knees, clutching her father's leg. "Please, Papa," she cried. "Don't throw me out. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." Marcus stepped back, shaking her off as though her touch burned him. "Leave this house," he said coldly. "I never want to see you again." Amara hesitated, torn between her husband's wrath and her daughter's desperation. Later that night, as Marcus snored in their bedroom, Amara crept to Zena's room. She passed a bundle of Zena's belongings through the window, clothes, a blanket, and a few naira notes wrapped in an old handkerchief. Zena reached for her mother's hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mama, please let me stay," she pleaded. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Amara's face was pale and drawn, her lips trembling as she whispered, "You know your father. If I let you stay, he'll only get angrier. Go, my child. Go and find your own way." Zena's heart broke as Amara pushed the bundle into her arms and turned away. Outside, the night was cold and quiet, the air thick with the scent of smoke from distant fires. Neighbors gathered as Zena stepped out of the compound, their voices rising in a cacophony of concern. "Marcus, have mercy on your child," one elderly man called out. "She's just a girl," another woman added. "Let her stay." But Marcus's response was final. "Anyone who thinks they can take her in is free to do so. But not under my roof." Zena wiped her tears with the edge of her wrapper and glanced back one last time. Amara stood in the shadows, her figure barely visible, watching but not moving to stop her. Zena's chest ached with the weight of betrayal. As she stepped onto the empty street, her world felt like it had crumbled. She clutched the small bundle close to her chest, her mind racing. She had no plan, no destination, and no idea what lay ahead. The moon cast a silvery glow over the deserted street as Zena wandered aimlessly, her belongings wrapped in a bundle perched atop her head. Her heart felt as heavy as her burden, each step weighted with despair and uncertainty. The muffled hum of crickets was her only companion as she trudged on, unsure where to go or what to do. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the day. She had been cast out like an intruder, the same home where she had shared laughter and love, now a cold, unwelcoming memory. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but she quickly blinked them away. She couldn't afford to cry. She had to think, to figure out her next move. As she passed a familiar row of houses, she heard a soft voice call out from the shadows, "Zena!" Startled, she froze, clutching her bundle tightly. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light and saw Aunt Grace, a kind neighbor known for her gentle demeanor, standing at the edge of her veranda. "Auntie Grace?" Zena whispered, her voice trembling. The older woman nodded, stepping closer. "Child, come here," she said softly, her tone a mix of concern and urgency. Zena approached hesitantly, her eyes darting around to make sure no one else was watching. When she reached the porch, Aunt Grace looked her over with a pained expression. "What has he done now?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "I heard the shouting earlier." Zena's lips quivered as she struggled to form the words. He threw me out," she stammered, her voice breaking. "He said I'm no longer welcome." Aunt Grace sighed heavily, shaking her head. "Your father's temper will be the death of him one day," she muttered. Reaching into the pocket of her wrapper, she pulled out a few naira notes and pressed them into Zena's hand. "Take this," she said, her voice firm. "It's not much, but it'll help you get somewhere safe." Zena's tears spilled over as she clutched the money tightly. "Thank you, Auntie Grace," she whispered, her gratitude immense. "I don't know what I would have done without you." The older woman waved off her thanks. "It's nothing, my dear. Now go, and may God guide your steps." Zena nodded, tucking the money into the folds of her wrapper. She turned to leave, but Aunt Grace stopped her with a gentle touch on her shoulder. "Listen to me, child," she said, her tone serious. "Don't let anyone make you feel worthless. You are stronger than you think, and this is not the end of your story. Do you hear me?" Zena nodded again, her chest tightening at the kindness in Aunt Grace's words. She stepped back onto the road, her resolve hardening as she walked away. The world felt a little less hostile with those words echoing in her mind. As the night deepened, Zena's thoughts turned to Ethan. He was the only person she could think of who might understand her plight. If she could just find him, perhaps she wouldn't feel so alone. But Ethan was in another state, far from here. She needed help, guidance, someone who might point her in the right direction. That's when she remembered his uncle, Mr. Harold. Ethan had stayed with him for years before moving back to his parents' home. Zena's heart quickened at the thought. Harold had always seemed reasonable, unlike her father. Perhaps he would know where Ethan was and could help her reach him. The decision made, Zena adjusted the bundle on her head and changed direction, heading toward Harold's house. The journey felt endless, her legs aching with every step, but determination pushed her forward. When she finally reached the modest bungalow, the lights were off and the compound was quiet. Zena hesitated, unsure if she should knock. What if he turned her away too? But she didn't have any other options. Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand and tapped gently on the wooden door. After a few moments, a light flickered on inside. The sound of shuffling feet grew louder, and the door creaked open to reveal Harold, his eyes bleary with sleep. He stared at Zena, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Zena?" he said, his voice rough from disuse. "What are you doing here? It's so late. Are you all right?" The floodgates opened as Zena stepped into the light, her tears spilling freely. "Uncle Harold," she began, her voice cracking. "I have nowhere else to go. Please, I need your help." Concern washed over Harold's face as he ushered her inside. Come in," he said, motioning to the worn sofa in the living room. "Sit down and tell me what's going on." Zena sat down gingerly, clutching her bundle as though it were a lifeline. Between sobs, she recounted everything: her pregnancy, her father's wrath, and her mother's reluctant rejection. Harold listened intently, his expression darkening with each detail. When she finished, Harold leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Your father has always been a stubborn man, but this is too much," he muttered. He sighed deeply, his frustration evident. Ethan didn't tell us anything about this before he left. Zena's voice was barely audible as she asked, "Do you know where he is, sir?" Harold hesitated before nodding. "He's with his parents now," he said. "I can give you their address, but Zena, are you sure this is the right thing to do?" "What else can I do?" Zena replied, her eyes filled with desperation. "I just need to find him. He has to know." Harold regarded her for a long moment before nodding. "All right," he said, rising from his chair. "Wait here." He disappeared into another room and returned moments later with a piece of paper and a small bundle of cash. Handing them to Zena, he said, "This is the address, and here's some money for your transport. Use it wisely and take care of yourself." Zena's hands trembled as she took the items, gratitude welling up in her chest. "Thank you, Uncle Harold," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Harold placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening. "You're a brave girl, Zena. Don't let anyone make you forget that." With that, Zena rose from the sofa, her heart heavy but determined. She bid Harold goodbye and stepped back into the night, clutching the address and money tightly. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since her father had cast her out, Zena felt a glimmer of hope. The sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the bustling bus terminal. Zena stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching her modest bundle and the slip of paper bearing Ethan's parents' address. Her heart raced as she scanned the sea of unfamiliar faces, overwhelmed by the chaos of the early morning commuters, shouting destinations and vendors hawking their wares. She approached a ticket counter hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, sir. Which bus goes to Rivers State?" The ticket seller glanced at her briefly before motioning to a row of vehicles parked along the far end of the terminal. "That one, over there, leaves in 20 minutes. Zena nodded her thanks, clutching the small wad of cash Harold had given her. She had never traveled so far alone before, and the thought of the journey ahead filled her with equal parts anxiety and determination. Taking a deep breath, she bought a ticket and boarded the bus, choosing a seat near the window where she could watch the world pass by. The ride was long and exhausting, the vehicle rattling over uneven roads as it made its way toward Rivers State. Zena leaned her head against the window, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. Would Ethan's family welcome her? Would Ethan himself even believe her? She clung tightly to the hope that Harold's gesture of kindness would not be in vain. After what felt like an eternity, the bus finally rolled to a stop at a crowded depot in Port Harcourt. Zena stepped off, her legs stiff from the journey. The air was humid and heavy, and the noise of the city was almost deafening compared to the quiet streets of her village. She unfolded the slip of paper with the address, studying it carefully. She had no idea where to begin. A young man carrying a stack of newspapers noticed her standing uncertainly by the side of the road. "Sister, you look lost," he said with a friendly smile. "Can I help you?" Zena hesitated for a moment before showing him the address. "Do you know where this is?" she asked. The man glanced at the paper and nodded. "Ah, yes, that's in Garrison. You'll need to take a taxi. It's not far, maybe 20 minutes. "Thank you," Zena said, her voice barely audible. She hailed a taxi and handed the driver a portion of her remaining cash, her hands trembling slightly as she climbed into the back seat. The taxi wove through the busy streets, and Zena's heart pounded harder with each turn. By the time the driver pulled up in front of a modest, single-story home surrounded by a small garden, she felt as though her chest might burst. She stepped out of the car, her legs shaky, and stared at the house for a long moment. The door opened, and a woman stepped outside. She was in her late 40s, her features sharp and her expression unreadable. Her eyes fell on Zena, and her brow furrowed. "Good afternoon, Ma," Zena said, her voice trembling. "Is this the home of Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton?" "Yes," the woman replied curtly. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Zena swallowed hard, clutching her bundle tighter. "My name is Zena, Ma. I've come to see Ethan." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Ethan? What business do you have with my son?" Zena hesitated, feeling the weight of the woman's stare. I'm pregnant, Ma," she finally said, her voice breaking. "It's Ethan's child." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The woman's expression darkened, and she took a step closer, her voice sharp. "Pregnant? For Ethan?" Do you think you can just show up here with a story like that and expect us to believe you? Zena opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the front door creaked open again, and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face lined with age but kind. He glanced between Zena and his wife, his expression curious. "What's going on here, Helen?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "This girl claims she's carrying Ethan's child," Helen said, her tone dripping with disbelief. The man, whom Zena guessed was Ethan's father, turned his gaze to her. His eyes softened as he took in her weary appearance and trembling hands. "Is that so?" he asked gently. "Yes, sir," Zena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where else to go." Ethan's father, Joseph, regarded her for a long moment before nodding. "Come inside," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. Helen started to protest, but Joseph silenced her with a look. Zena stepped into the house, her heart racing as she took in the modest living room. It was tidy but sparse, with mismatched furniture and family photos adorning the walls. She felt a pang of homesickness as she imagined her own family sitting together around the dining table, laughing and sharing stories. Joseph motioned for her to sit down, then took a seat across from her. "Tell me everything," he said. Zena poured out her story, her voice trembling as she recounted her relationship with Ethan, her father's anger, and her journey to find him. Joseph listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying little. Helen, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, looked less convinced. When Zena finished, Joseph leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "You've been through a lot," he said finally, "and I believe you. But Ethan's not here right now. He's joined the military." Zena's heart sank at the news, but she nodded, her voice quiet. "I understand, sir." Joseph glanced at Helen, who still wore a disapproving scowl. "She can stay in the spare room until Ethan returns," he said firmly. "What?" Helen exclaimed. "You're just going to let her stay here?" "She's carrying our grandchild," Joseph replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's the least we can do." Helen huffed and stormed out of the room, muttering under her breath. Joseph turned back to Zena, offering her a small smile. "Don't mind her. She'll come around." Tears of relief filled Zena's eyes as she nodded. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. Joseph stood and gestured for her to follow him. He led her to a small room at the back of the house, its furnishings simple but clean. "Make yourself at home," he said. "You're safe here." That evening, Joseph called Zena to the living room, where he introduced her to Ethan's younger siblings. Tara, a bubbly 10-year-old girl, greeted her warmly, her curiosity evident in her wide eyes and constant questions. Caleb, a surly teenager, barely acknowledged her, muttering a curt hi before disappearing into his room. "You're safe here," Joseph reassured Zena once again. "If you need anything, let me know." "Thank you, sir," Zena said, her voice filled with gratitude. As Zena lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, she felt a flicker of hope. Joseph's kindness was a small but significant comfort, even as Helen's hostility and Caleb's indifference loomed large. She resolved to endure whatever challenges lay ahead, for the sake of her unborn child. Zena woke up to the smell of fried plantains wafting through the air. For a brief moment, she felt a sense of normalcy, like she was back at her own home. But the hard mattress beneath her and the unfamiliar room reminded her of her reality. She had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning as thoughts of her uncertain future weighed heavily on her mind. By the time she made her way to the kitchen, Joseph was seated at the dining table, sipping his morning tea. Tara was chatting animatedly beside him, her bright laughter filling the room. Helen, standing by the stove, stiffened at the sight of Zena. "You're finally up," Helen said sharply. "Don't think you're going to lounge around here doing nothing. You're not a guest." Zena nodded quickly. "Yes, Ma, I'll help." Helen scoffed, placing a plate of fried plantains and eggs on the table. "Help? Let's see how much use you'll be." Joseph shot Helen a warning look but didn't say anything. He turned to Zena with a kind smile. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" "Yes, sir," Zena lied, forcing a small smile. Tara, oblivious to the tension, tugged at Zena's hand. "Are you really having a baby?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Zena hesitated before nodding. "Yes, I am." "Wow. Can I help take care of the baby when it's here?" Tara asked, her excitement bubbling over. Of course, Zena replied, her smile becoming genuine for the first time that morning. Helen clanged a pot loudly, drawing everyone's attention. Don't fill her head with ideas, Tara, she said. This girl won't be here long enough for that. Tara's face fell, but Joseph intervened. Helen, that's enough, he said firmly. Let's all sit down and have breakfast. Helen muttered under her breath, but obeyed. Zena sat quietly at the table, eating sparingly as the rest of the family chatted. Caleb was notably absent, which Zena took as a small relief. Despite the tension, Zena found small moments of solace. Tara often sat with her, chatting about school or asking endless questions about babies. Joseph, though busy with work, checked in on her regularly, offering encouragement and reassurances. One evening, as Zena washed dishes in the kitchen, Joseph approached her. You're doing well, he said gently. I know it's not easy. Thank you, sir, Zena replied, her voice soft. I spoke to Ethan yesterday, Joseph continued, his tone cautious. I told him about the situation. Zena's heart skipped a beat. What? What did he say? Joseph hesitated. He didn't say much, but I think he needs time to process everything. Don't lose hope. Zena nodded, though she felt a pang of doubt. Time was something she didn't feel she had. 6 months into her pregnancy, Zena's world was shaken once again. It was a quiet afternoon when the sound of a car pulling into the driveway caught her attention. She peeked out the window and froze. Ethan was stepping out of the car, his military uniform crisp and immaculate. Her heart raced as she rushed to the door. Ethan looked up as she stepped outside, his expression unreadable. He stood still as she approached, his gaze scanning her from head to toe. Ethan, she said breathlessly. Zena, he replied, his tone distant. The moment felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't quite grasp. She took a step closer, but his lack of warmth stopped her in her tracks. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice cold. Zena's throat tightened. I came because I didn't have anywhere else to go. Ethan's jaw clenched, and he glanced toward the house. Helen appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up when she saw her son. My boy, she exclaimed, rushing to embrace him. Ethan returned the hug briefly before pulling away. What's going on? He asked, nodding toward Zena. Helen's smile vanished. She showed up here months ago, claiming you're the father of her baby. Ethan's expression darkened. Is that true? Yes, Zena said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze piercing. Finally he turned to his father, who had come to stand beside Helen. Is she staying here? Ethan asked. Yes, she is, Joseph said firmly. And we need to talk. Ethan nodded, his face hardening. Fine. Let's talk. As they headed inside, Zena's heart sank. This wasn't the reunion she had hoped for. She could only pray that Joseph's influence would soften Ethan's heart. The tension in the living room was suffocating as Ethan sat across from his father, Joseph, while Zena stood awkwardly near the doorway, unsure if she was welcome to sit. Helen sat with her arms crossed, her sharp gaze darting between Ethan and Zena like a hawk circling its prey. Joseph leaned forward, his hands clasped. Ethan, this is serious. Zena came here because she had nowhere else to go, and whether you like it or not, she claims this child is yours. Ethan rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated. He avoided looking at Zena, his eyes fixed on the floor. Dad, I don't even know what to say. This is a lot. It's not just about what you want to say, Joseph said, his tone firm but not unkind. It's about responsibility. Finally, Ethan turned to Zena, his eyes hard and questioning. Is it true? Is the baby really mine? Zena met his gaze, her heart pounding. Yes, Ethan. I wouldn't lie about something like this. Helen snorted, her skepticism evident. You wouldn't lie? That's rich. You just conveniently show up here pregnant after Ethan left. Sounds like a setup to me. Enough, Helen, Joseph interjected, his voice stern. This isn't helping. Ethan shook his head, leaning back in his chair. I don't even know what to think. Why didn't you try to reach me before coming here? I didn't have any way to reach you, Zena replied, her voice trembling. Your uncle gave me this address. I thought you'd want to know. Joseph sighed. Ethan, you have to understand the position Zena is in. She's a young girl, far from home, and carrying a child. If this child is yours, then you have a duty to step up. Ethan finally stood, pacing the room. Dad, I just started my military career. I'm not ready for this. I can barely take care of myself, let alone a baby. Joseph stood as well, his imposing frame radiating authority. Ethan, readiness doesn't matter here. This is about doing what's right. If this child is yours, then you have to take responsibility. Ethan, Zena said softly, her voice breaking. I'm not asking for much. I just want our child to have a chance. I don't want them to grow up feeling unwanted. Ethan stopped pacing, his back to Zena. For a moment the room was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Joseph took a step closer to his son. Ethan, you need to answer for this now. This isn't something you can avoid. Finally, Ethan turned around, his face a mask of resignation. Okay, he said, his voice low. I won't deny it. The baby is mine, but I'm not ready to get married, Dad. Joseph nodded slowly. I understand that, but acknowledging your responsibility is the first step. This isn't just about marriage, Ethan. It's about being there for your child. Helen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I can't believe this. Ethan, are you seriously just going to take her word for it? What if it's not even your child? Helen! Joseph's voice boomed. That's enough. This is my house and I've made my decision. Zena stays here until the baby is born, and Ethan will do his part whether he's ready or not. Ethan looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew better than to cross his father. He nodded reluctantly, his jaw tight. Fine. I'll do what I can. Zena felt a small glimmer of relief, but Ethan's cold tone and lack of warmth made her chest ache. This wasn't the reunion she had dreamed of, but at least he wasn't denying the baby outright. That evening, Zena sat in her room, staring at the small bundle of baby clothes she had started to gather. The reality of the situation weighed heavily on her. Ethan's acknowledgement of the baby felt hollow, like he was doing it out of obligation rather than care. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Come in, she called. The door opened and Joseph stepped inside, carrying a tray with a plate of food and a cup of tea. You didn't come out for dinner, he said gently. I thought you might be hungry. Zena managed a small smile. Thank you, sir. He set the tray down on the bedside table and sat on the edge of the bed. I know this isn't easy, he said, his voice kind. But I want you to know that you're not alone in this. No matter what Helen says or how Ethan acts, I'll make sure you and this baby are cared for. Tears welled up in Zena's eyes. Thank you. That means so much to me. Joseph placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Get some rest. You'll need your strength for what's ahead. As he left the room, Zena felt a small spark of hope. Though her path was uncertain and filled with challenges, Joseph's kindness reminded her that not everyone had turned their back on her. She resolved to stay strong, for herself and for the child growing inside her. The months passed slowly, each day a mix of anticipation and tension for Zena. The once welcoming warmth from Joseph was the only solace she had in the household, as Helen's resentment grew sharper and Caleb's hostility became harder to endure. Ethan had returned to his military base, leaving her to navigate the hostility of the household without him. Despite her determination to stay strong for her unborn child, the isolation weighed heavily on her. Zena was sweeping the living room one morning when she heard Caleb's voice behind her, filled with annoyance. Move out of the way, or do you think your belly gives you the right to block everyone's path? He sneered. Zena clenched her teeth and stepped aside, choosing to ignore him. She had learned early on that arguing with Caleb only escalated matters, but Caleb wasn't finished. You've been here for months, eating our food and doing nothing but waiting for someone to pity you. When are you going to start earning your keep? He taunted. Zena froze, her hands gripping the broom tightly. I do my part, she said quietly. I clean the house, cook meals, and help wherever I can. I'm not trying to be a burden. Your very existence is a burden. Caleb shot back. Zena tried to walk away, but Caleb grabbed her arm. Don't turn your back on me when I'm talking to you, he snarled. Let me go, Caleb, Zena said, panic rising in her chest. Before she could free herself, he shoved her roughly and she stumbled backward. Her foot caught on the edge of the rug and she fell hard onto the tiled floor. Pain shot through her abdomen, sharp and sudden. A cry escaped her lips as she clutched her stomach, her vision blurring. Helen appeared in the doorway, her face a mixture of shock and irritation. "What's going on here?" she demanded. "She fell," Caleb said defensively, though his guilty expression betrayed him. Zena tried to speak, but the pain was overwhelming. "The baby," she gasped, clutching her belly as a wave of panic swept over her. Helen's expression hardened. "Caleb, call your father. Now." Joseph arrived moments later, rushing into the room as Helen helped Zena onto the couch. "What happened?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "She fell," Helen said tersely. "And now she's saying something's wrong with the baby." Joseph's face paled. "We need to get her to the hospital. Caleb, get the car." At the hospital, Zena was rushed into the emergency room. The hours that followed were a blur of pain, fear, and uncertainty. The doctors moved quickly, speaking in hushed tones as they prepared her for an emergency cesarean section. Zena barely had time to process what was happening before she was wheeled into the operating room. "Please save my babies," she whispered as the anesthesia took effect. When she woke up, the room was quiet except for the faint beeping of monitors. Her body ached, but the sharp pain in her abdomen was gone. A nurse stood by her bedside, adjusting an IV line. "Your babies are fine," the nurse said with a reassuring smile. "A boy and a girl. They're in the nursery, resting." Tears filled Zena's eyes as relief washed over her. "Thank you," she whispered. A few hours later, Joseph arrived at her bedside, his face etched with worry. He held her hand gently. "I'm so glad you're okay," he said. "And the twins are beautiful. You've been so strong through all of this." Zena nodded, her voice trembling. "I didn't think I could do it, but I had to. For them." Joseph smiled softly. "You've shown more strength than anyone could have expected. And now you're a mother. That's something to be proud of." 2 weeks after returning from the hospital, Zena was slowly regaining her strength, adjusting to life as a mother. The twins, whom she named Emmanuel and Grace, brought moments of joy amidst the tension in Ethan's family home. However, the household's hostility had only grown worse. Helen's resentment became more open, and Caleb continued to treat Zena with disdain. Even Tara, who had initially been kind, seemed distant, perhaps worn down by the family's disapproval. Joseph, however, remained a pillar of support. One morning, he approached Zena as she sat on the porch rocking the twins in a makeshift cradle. "Zena," Joseph began gently, "I've been thinking. This situation isn't fair to you. You've endured so much, and Ethan, he hasn't done his part." Zena nodded silently, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't want to appear ungrateful, but she was exhausted, mentally, physically, and emotionally. Joseph crouched beside her. "It's time Ethan faced his responsibilities. I want you to go to his base. He needs to see the twins and understand what's at stake." Zena hesitated. The idea of confronting Ethan in his new environment frightened her. What if he rejected her again? What if his reaction hurt her children? "But what if he still doesn't want us?" Zena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Joseph placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He needs to see what he's missing. And if he chooses to turn his back on you and these children, that will be his shame, not yours." The following morning, Joseph gave Zena some money and Ethan's address. He also arranged for a driver to take her to the military barracks where Ethan was stationed. As she prepared to leave, Helen stood by the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression cold. "So, you're going to chase after him now? Do you have no pride?" Helen spat. Zena ignored the remark, focused on securing her babies in the basket she used to carry them. Joseph came to the doorway, his stern gaze silencing Helen. "Let her go," he said firmly. "She's doing what Ethan should have done months ago." Helen scoffed but stepped aside, muttering under her breath. Zena thanked Joseph with a small smile before climbing into the car with her children. The journey to Ethan's base was long and tiring, but Zena stayed strong for the twins. She arrived at the gates of the barracks late in the afternoon, the sun beating down mercilessly. A young soldier standing guard approached her. "Good day, ma'am. How can I help you?" he asked. "I'm here to see Ethan Miller," Zena replied, her voice trembling slightly. The soldier looked at her curiously but nodded. "Wait here. I'll send someone to fetch him." Zena waited under the shade of a nearby tree, her nerves unraveling with each passing minute. Emmanuel began to fuss, and Zena rocked him gently while Grace slept peacefully beside him. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan appeared, flanked by another soldier. He looked startled when he saw Zena, his gaze quickly shifting to the twins. His expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" Ethan demanded, his voice low but sharp. Zena straightened her back, meeting his gaze. "I've brought your children to see you, Ethan. They deserve to know their father." Ethan scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "I told you before, I'm not ready for this. You shouldn't have come." Zena felt her heart sink, but she held her ground. "Not ready. Ethan, they're your children. They didn't ask to be born, but they're here. You can't just pretend they don't exist." Ethan's eyes flickered with something. Guilt, perhaps, but he quickly masked it. "I'm not denying them," he said defensively. "But you can't just show up like this. I have a life here." Before Zena could respond, a voice called out from behind Ethan. "Who's this?" Zena turned to see a young woman approaching. She was tall, poised, and wore a military uniform. Her sharp gaze swept over Zena and the twins before settling on Ethan. "This is, someone I used to know," Ethan said awkwardly. "She's just leaving." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "And the babies?" Ethan hesitated, but before he could answer, Zena spoke up. "These are his children." The woman's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed as she turned back to Ethan. "Is this true?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The woman's expression hardened, and she stepped closer to Zena. "I'm Captain Sade," she introduced herself. "Why don't you come with me?" Captain Sade led Zena to her quarters, offering her a chair and something to drink. Zena hesitated, but eventually accepted, grateful for the kindness. Sade asked about her situation, listening attentively as Zena recounted everything, from her expulsion from her family home to the hostility she faced at Ethan's house. When Zena finished, Sade sighed, shaking her head. "I'm sorry you've had to go through all this. It's unacceptable." Zena lowered her gaze, feeling a mixture of shame and relief. "I didn't know where else to go," she admitted. I hoped Ethan would step up." Sade's expression hardened. "He will. Trust me, he doesn't have a choice." Later that evening, Sade confronted Ethan. Zena didn't hear the conversation, but the muffled shouting from the other side of the door made it clear that Sade wasn't holding back. When Sade emerged, her expression was calm but resolute. "Don't worry, Zena," she said. "You and your children will be safe here for now. And as for Ethan, he has some growing up to do." For the first time in what felt like forever, Zena felt a glimmer of hope. Captain Sade's compassion and strength gave her a sense of security she hadn't known since the day she was cast out of her home. As she cradled her twins that night, Zena whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. Perhaps this was the beginning of something better. Zena awoke in Captain Sade's quarters to sunlight filtering through the small window. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of calm. Her twins, Emmanuel and Grace, slept peacefully beside her, their soft breaths a soothing rhythm. Captain Sade entered with a tray of bread and tea, her presence both commanding and comforting. "Good morning, Zena," she said warmly. "How are you feeling?" Zena managed a small smile. "Better, Ma. Thank you." Sade waved off the gratitude. "No thanks needed. Now, let's discuss what's next." Zena's heart tightened. "I don't know where to go. I can't stay here forever, and I can't go back to Ethan's house." Sade nodded thoughtfully. "For now, you'll stay here. But Ethan needs to take responsibility. I've already spoken to him. This isn't over." That afternoon, Ethan arrived, visibly uneasy. Sade's tone was firm as she addressed him. "Ethan, you're avoiding your responsibilities. Whether or not you feel ready to be a father, the twins exist, and Zena deserves your respect." Ethan hesitated, finally muttering, "I'll send money." Money isn't enough, Sade replied sharply. You'll do better, or I'll ensure your commanding officer learns the truth. Over the next days, Zena began to find stability under Sadie's guidance. She learned to manage her finances and care for her twins more efficiently. Though Ethan's visits were sporadic and strained, Sade ensured he contributed both financially and emotionally. One afternoon, Zena returned from a walk to find Ethan's girlfriend, Clara, arguing with Sade. "She's lying about the babies being his," Clara shouted. "They are his," Zena said, stepping into the room, "and I don't need your approval." Clara's retort was cut short by Sade. "This is my house and I won't tolerate your behavior. Leave now." Clara stormed out, but the encounter left Zena shaken. Sade reassured her, "You've faced worse. Don't let her get to you." A week later, Sadie convened a meeting with Ethan, Clara, and Zena. Her tone was resolute. "The harassment ends now. Apologize to Zena. Publicly." Ethan's voice was barely audible as he said, "I'm sorry." Clara muttered a curt apology after a sharp glare from Sade. That evening, Zena fed her twins, reflecting on the strength she'd found in Sade's unwavering support. "Thank you, Ma," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. Sade smiled. "You don't owe me anything. Just promise to remember your worth." As the night settled, Zena held her children close, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Though Zena felt safe in Captain Sade's care, she knew it was time to confront the past. One evening, Sade sat her down. "Zena, you've made progress, but you need closure with Ethan's family. Avoiding them won't bring peace." Zena's voice trembled. "I'm scared, Ma. They didn't want me there." Sade placed a hand on hers. "You're stronger than you think. Hold your head high." The next morning, Zena hugged Sade tightly before leaving with her twins. The journey felt long and uncertain, her thoughts racing. What awaited her? Would Joseph still support her, or had everything changed? Arriving at the house, Zena was greeted by a somber scene. Neighbors murmured, their expressions grave. Tara, Ethan's sister, stepped forward hesitantly. "Papa, he's gone." Zena's heart sank. "Joseph? He's dead?" Tara nodded, tears spilling. "Last night. It was sudden." Inside, the air was heavy with grief. Helen's face was a mix of sorrow and resentment, while Ethan sat silently, his head bowed. Zena's presence ignited Helen's anger. "Why are you here?" Helen spat. "Haven't you caused enough trouble?" Zena steadied herself. "I came to pay my respects. Joseph was kind to me when no one else was." Helen scoffed, but Zena stood her ground. That evening, the family gathered to discuss funeral arrangements. Uncle Ben addressed them, holding a small recorder. "Joseph left specific wishes. Let's listen." Joseph's warm, firm voice filled the room. "Zena, you are like a daughter to me. Ethan, marry her and care for her and the children. This is my dying wish." The room erupted. Helen protested vehemently. "This is absurd. She trapped him." Uncle Ben silenced her. "His wishes are clear. They must be honored." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I didn't ask for this. I'm not ready for marriage." Uncle Ben's voice was stern. "This isn't about you, Ethan. It's about doing the right thing." Zena sat quietly, overwhelmed. Marriage had never been her goal, but Joseph's wish felt like a final gift, a chance at stability. The next morning, the elders performed a simple traditional ceremony. Ethan's reluctance was evident, but he complied. Zena, holding her twins, felt a mix of gratitude and apprehension. Would this union bring peace or more pain? That night, as the house grew quiet, Zena sat alone with her twins in the room Joseph had once given her. She whispered a prayer, determined to honor his legacy by staying strong. Her path was uncertain, but she resolved to face it with courage. The morning after the traditional ceremony, the atmosphere in the house remained tense. Helen barely acknowledged Zena, while Caleb cast her suspicious glances, as if he couldn't trust her presence. Ethan avoided Zena entirely, his discomfort with the situation clear. The weight of Joseph's final wish loomed over everyone. Zena focused on her twins, finding solace in their innocence. As they giggled and babbled, their joy was a reminder that she needed to remain strong for them, no matter how unwelcome she felt. The day of Joseph's burial arrived. The family gathered in the courtyard, joined by neighbors and relatives. The pastor led a somber service, recounting Joseph's kindness, wisdom, and unwavering sense of responsibility. Zina stood with the twins in her arms, listening to the words, but her heart was heavy. Joseph had been her greatest supporter, and now he was gone. After the service, Zina tried to help with the burial arrangements. She fetched water, arranged chairs, and served drinks to guests. But Helen wasn't having it. "Stop pretending to be part of this family," Helen snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "You've done enough damage." Zina stepped back, her heart sinking. But just as she was about to retreat, Tara, Ethan's younger sister, stepped in. "She's done nothing wrong, Mama. If anything, she's the only one honoring Papa's wishes," Tara said firmly. Helen glared at her daughter but said nothing, leaving Zina to quietly continue helping. After the burial, the elders gathered the family once more to finalize Joseph's wishes. Uncle Ben spoke first. "Now that the marriage rites are complete, Ethan, you are responsible for Zina and her children. You must take her and the twins to your base. Your father made this very clear." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'll take her, but don't expect me to play the perfect husband." Uncle Ben's expression darkened. "This is not about perfection. It's about responsibility and respect. If you choose to ignore that, you're dishonoring your father's memory." Zina remained silent, her mind racing. She didn't want to depend on Ethan, especially when he showed no intention of caring for her or the twins. But where else could she go? For now, she had to accept this path and hope for the best. The following day, Zina prepared to leave with Ethan. Tara helped her pack, her presence a source of comfort in an otherwise hostile household. "You'll be okay, Auntie Zina," Tara whispered as she hugged her tightly. "You're stronger than you think." Zina wiped away a tear, grateful for Tara's kindness. "Thank you, Tara. I'll miss you." The goodbyes were brief, and soon Zina and the twins were on a bus with Ethan, heading to his military base. Zina cradled the twins, their warmth grounding her as she braced herself for the unknown. The journey to Ethan's base was silent. Ethan stared out the window, his expression distant, while Zina focused on keeping the twins calm. When they finally arrived, the sight of the military compound was both intimidating and surreal. Rows of identical barracks stretched out before them, filled with soldiers going about their routines. Ethan led Zina to his flat, a small, sparsely furnished space. As he unlocked the door, Zina noticed the tension in his movements. He gestured for her to enter without a word. The flat was neat but impersonal, a reflection of Ethan's detached demeanor. Zina set the twins down on a blanket she had brought, creating a makeshift play area for them. "This is where you'll stay," Ethan said, his tone clipped. "I don't have time for drama, so keep to yourself." Zina nodded, biting back a retort. She didn't expect kindness from Ethan, but his coldness still stung. Over the next few days, Zina settled into the flat. She cooked, cleaned, and cared for the twins, keeping her interactions with Ethan to a minimum. He spent most of his time at work, leaving early and returning late. When he was home, he barely spoke to her, his indifference palpable. Despite the challenges, Zina found small moments of solace. A neighbor, Corporal Ada, noticed her struggle and offered support. Ada had a warm, no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Zina of Captain Sade. "You're doing well, Zina," Ada said one afternoon as she held one of the twins. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Zina smiled weakly, grateful for the encouragement. "Thank you, Ma." One evening, Ethan returned home to find the twins crawling on the floor, giggling as they played with a small wooden toy Zina had carved for them. He paused in the doorway, watching them for a moment before clearing his throat. "Dinner ready?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Yes," Zina replied, setting a plate on the table. As they ate in silence, Ethan's gaze occasionally drifted to the twins. For the first time, Zina noticed a flicker of something in his expression. Curiosity, perhaps even a hint of warmth. It wasn't much, but it gave her a sliver of hope. Over the weeks, Ethan's demeanor began to shift. He started coming home earlier, sometimes bringing small gifts for the twins. A rattle, a blanket, a soft toy. He even joined them on the floor one evening, laughing as the twins crawled over him. Zina watched quietly, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and caution. She didn't know if Ethan's change was genuine or fleeting, but she clung to the possibility that they could find a way forward. One night, as the twins slept, Ethan sat at the table with Zina. He hesitated before speaking. "I never wanted any of this," he admitted, his voice low. "But seeing them, seeing you, I think I owe you more than I've given." Zena looked at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. "I don't need much, Ethan. Just respect and kindness for me and the twins." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'll try." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was a start. And for Zena, after everything she had endured, it was enough to kindle a spark of hope for the future. Dich! As Zena tucked her twins into bed, she looked out at the moonlit sky, her heart swelling with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She had walked a path riddled with pain, rejection, and heartbreak, but she had emerged stronger, more resilient, and fiercely determined to create a better future for her children. Her journey wasn't perfect, far from it. Yet it was a testament to the power of hope, the kindness of unexpected allies, and the courage to rise above life's harshest trials. Zena smiled softly, whispering a promise to herself and her children. No matter what lies ahead, we'll face it together. In that moment, she knew her story wasn't just about survival. It was about finding the strength to thrive. Life is full of struggles, but every setback holds the seed of a comeback. No matter how dark the night, the dawn will always come. Believe in your strength, seek out kindness, and never stop fighting for a brighter tomorrow. If Zena's journey moved you, don't let it stop here. Hit that subscribe button, and share this story to inspire others. Together, we can celebrate resilience, courage, and the power of hope.